السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I was 24 years old. I was walking out of my job and my boss calls me and says, Amin, I want you to come into my office. Now, as he closes the door and asks me to sit down, what I realize is that this is not a normal conversation. My manager, Eviano, was a little bit concerned. I could see it on his face. So when I sat down, he looked at me and he said, Amin, I'm worried about you. I said, what do you mean? He said, Amin, you're 24 years old. You're on the board of your local masjid. You're doing work for Muslim children, and you just came back from the Middle East for the second time in 6 months. And I said, okay, so? He said, Amin, I'm worried that you're turning into an extremist. And of course I laughed, and I was not turning into an extremist, but it was an important time for me to reflect, because if someone would have asked me, Amin, when I was 14 years old or 15 years old, would you be on the board of the masjid, would you be doing any of these things? The answer would have been no. So I thought for a moment to step back and say, well, how did this happen? My story, and like many of our stories, doesn't start with me. It actually started with my parents. My dad grew up in Karachi, Pakistan. And when he was 12 years old, my dad became an orphan. And he reminds me every year during the month of Ramadan, because during the month of Ramadan, during Sahur, my mom would always ask, Amin, do you want 1 egg or 2 eggs? And I would say 2, and my dad would say, Amin, when we're in Pakistan, we were so poor, me and my 4 siblings, we would share 2 eggs. But he had big dreams. And alhamdulillah, he ended up coming to the United States of America, in Chicago. And alhamdulillah, he dreamed of beautiful things. Big houses, beautiful cars, an amazing lifestyle. Unfortunately, that was not the case. My dad left the hood of Karachi, Pakistan for the hood of the United States of America. My dad tells me that within 6 months of arriving, he had gotten robbed, he had gotten mugged, he lost everything. And a moment came when he thought to himself, should I stay here or should I go back to Pakistan? So he called his brother, his Bhaijan. He said, Bhaijan, I don't know if I can do this. Bhaijan, I want to come home. Bhaijan, I don't know if I want to stay here. And his older brother said, look, try to make it work. So taxi driver, my dad did that. Bus boy, my dad did that. My dad said he would bus dishes for so long that he'd feel like vomiting. But alhamdulillah, 4 years passed. He got a degree in computer science, and he moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, mashallah, in the 1970s, there was no concept of Indian and Pakistani people in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They thought my dad was a weird kind of Latino. But when enough Indian and Pakistani people come into an area, they begin, of course, to invest into an important institution, something that they care very dearly about, something that they would, of course, try to bring into their communities if they leave them. And of course, you're likely thinking, I'm talking about a masjid. But before there was a masjid in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Indian and Pakistani people came together and they created a Bollywood cinema. Now this is actually where my dad and some of these families ended up meeting other Muslim people. And it was at that time when he heard other people discussing Eid Salah, and he said, where are we going to perform Eid Salah? We have to find a place to pray. And so he and these 5 other families ended up breaking ground in one of the first masjids in Minnesota. Now it was a very interesting thing because my dad at that time was about 30 years old, which is about how old I am. And I asked my dad, I said, Dad, that's a pretty significant investment to make when you are, 30 years old, to part ways with your wealth to build an institution. I mean, that's a serious investment. But he said, Amin, it was so easy. It was such an easy thing for us to do because I had children. We worried about our kids. How are our kids going to grow up? How are our kids going to maintain their religion? How would our kids make sure that generations from now, they would still say, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah? We needed this. So they built it. And for the first 18 years of my life, I went to that Sunday school. What is salah, how to perform salah, I learned that. What is zakah, how to calculate zakah, I learned that. What is hajj and how to perform tawaf, I learned that. We also had Arabic class. And in the spirit of transparency, let me share with you, Arabic was very difficult for me as someone who was born in America to Pakistani parents. And mashallah, they always wanted the best. They always wanted me to bring home, A grades, like the best grades. But Arabic didn't always come easy. I remember one time I had a Arabic exam in my Sunday school, and unfortunately I didn't prepare, but I still wanted to do well, so I actually took some of the, took a pen and I wrote some of the Arabic on my arm so I could pass the exam. Alhamdulillah, I passed the exam, but the next day in my public school I had a math exam, and as I was turning in the math exam, my teacher saw this Arabic on my arm and she said, Amin, what are you doing? Are you cheating in math? And the whole class begins looking at me and said, no, I'm not cheating in math. And she said, well, what are you cheating in? And I looked in front of the whole class and I said, I'm cheating in religion. The reason why I'm sharing this with you is because, of course, this story is one that perhaps many of us can relate to in some way, shape, or form. As many of us in this community are immigrants from perhaps different areas. But for me, and perhaps like many of you, things changed. They changed on September 11th. I was 13 years old. There were Muslim men from Muslim countries with Muslim beards and Islamic intentions. And at 13 years old, all I wanted to do was fit in. But being Muslim didn't help. I remember friends would start to bully me. They'd tease me during the month of Ramadan. They'd say, what, are you terrorizing your body? I remember how much I loved playing baseball. My mom, she would come, she'd sit in the stands and she would cheer. But friends would start to tease her. They'd make fun of my mom because of her hijab. And as a 13-year-old, I didn't know what to do. I began telling my mom to pick me up 15 minutes after games were finished because I didn't want anyone to see my mom. I didn't want anyone to know that I was a Muslim. I wanted to fit in. In college, things began to change. And it began to change because I began to appreciate the plight of other minority groups in the United States of America before the Muslims, namely the Black and Latino communities. I read about a piece of research that was done not too far away from here by two researchers named Kenneth and Mamie Clark in the 1950s at Columbia University. They wanted to understand what was the impact of discrimination on young black boys and girls in the United States of America. And so they presented these children with two dolls, a black doll and a white doll. And they asked the children a battery of questions. Questions like, which doll is beautiful, which doll is ugly? Which doll do you want to play with? Which doll don't you want to play with? Which doll is good? Which doll is evil? And after asking all of those questions, the researchers then asked little boy or girl, which doll looks like you? 70%, a majority of these black boys and girls would pick up the black doll and say, this is the doll that's evil. This is the doll that's ugly. This is the doll that I don't want to play with. And this is the doll that looks like me. These researchers discovered something incredible. That is, in an environment steeped with discrimination, the issue wasn't just how the rest of the world looked at this community, but how young boys and girls who grew up in this community began to look at themselves. These researchers discovered something that's known as internalized oppression. Now, in learning about this, me in college reflecting on this, started thinking about my experience. And the feelings I had, and the actions I took. And I couldn't help but think, perhaps I'm not too different from these boys and girls because I've been in an environment that has been painting myself and my people and my religion in such a negative light. Perhaps this has affected the way that I too look at myself. Of course, now we fast forward. Over 17 years had passed since 9/11. And we know through events that have happened just in the last 3 weeks in places like New Zealand that anti-Muslim sentiment and rhetoric has not gone away. It still exists, and it has increased to a level that we have not seen before. So the question that we begin to ask ourselves is, how do we solve this problem? Especially among our children, how do we build confidence in the religious identity of our young Muslim boys and girls? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدي محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Our team at Noor Kids, alhamdulillah, had the opportunity to study at Harvard, at Berkeley, and San Francisco State University around this problem. How do we build confidence in the identity of Muslim children? Inshallah, today during this khutbah, I'm going to be sharing a couple of the items that we find in the secular research, but are also supported by our religious traditions. Inshallah, this evening, for the families that are interested, we'll be exploring this further. But the first thing is with respect to role models. As we think about the human condition, one of the things that we find in the literature is that there are two different types of role models. The first is what's called an in-group role model. That is for a Muslim child to see another Muslim individual who's perhaps older than them. And that Muslim child seeing this other Muslim individual who embodies, well, what does it mean to be Muslim? What does it mean to be strong and confident and being completely comfortable with who they are? Now, of course, we can think about this in one way to say people like Representative Ilhan Omar, which, by the way, I'm from Minnesota, this is one of our representatives. We can look at someone like this. Or, for example, the Imam of our masjid or something like this. But of course, there's another in-group role model that sometimes we forget about, and that is our prophets, the noble companions, the holy household. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because if I asked you today, who are your role models? Who's somebody who you look up to? What is the last biography that you've read? Many people might say, well, I'm really interested in the story of Elon Musk. Or I'm very interested in the story of Steve Jobs. Or if I'm, someone who's younger, I might say I'm really interested in the story of Stephen Curry or LeBron James or something like this. The question is, do we actually take these individuals that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us as role models? Do we allow these individuals to change our lives and impact us in the way that role models are supposed to? Now, in the literature around role models, there's a whole host of information, but one of the key variables that's consistent is in order for an individual to become a role model, they must be relatable. If you can't relate to somebody, that somebody will never be a role model to you. So put it differently, sometimes we as youth might look at someone like Stephen Curry or LeBron James as a role model because I like basketball and he's a basketball player. Or I am a human being and they too are a human being, and because of that I can look up to them and they are a role model to me. So why is it that we don't look at our prophets, the companions, the holy household? Why is it that practically speaking oftentimes we don't actually use these individuals as role models? Now, I can't speak to everyone else's experience, but I can speak to mine, and it had to do with relatability. Oftentimes when we use these stories and we talk about the seerah of our Holy Prophet, when I was a child, I was never taught about the story that I could, in a way that I could relate to. I almost didn't even recognize my Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be on him, as a human being. Yet, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, in Surah Mu'minun, He talks about prophets And the people challenge the prophets and they say, how can they be prophets? They eat just like I eat and they sleep just like I sleep. So one of the key things that's important for us to recognize is the value of role models. Role models are a key way through which individuals see an identity and then they role model it. And we can perhaps see that in our own lives, that the way that role models have shaped us. The second piece relates to critical thinking. Do you recall when I was talking about my experience in Sunday school? What is Hajj? How to perform Tawaf? I learned that. What is Salah? How to perform Salah? I learned that. What is Zakah? How to calculate Zakah? I learned that. But nobody ever told me why. As children who are growing up as a religious minority, understanding why we believe in what we believe is a critical part towards owning this set of traditions and beliefs. And of course, this is something that is not removed from our religious tradition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran implores us to reflect through tafakkur, critical thinking. In no less than 30 times in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to reflect. One of my teachers eloquently says, if the companions of the Holy Prophet did not critically think and just simply submitted to whatever their parents said, they never would have converted. They never would have changed their ways. Now the reason why I share this is because when I was a child, for example, sometimes I would go to my parents and I would ask real, authentic questions. And sometimes when I would ask those questions, my father, and I say this as an example, inshallah, Allah blesses my father and gives him the best of this world and the hereafter, but I use this as an example such that perhaps we can learn from it. Sometimes I would ask him a question and I'd say, Dad, how do we know there's a hereafter? Or something like this. And my dad would sometimes respond by saying, Amin, we don't ask these types of questions. Now I recognize it's not that we don't ask those types of questions. My dad in Minneapolis, where we didn't, for example, have a resident imam, he himself perhaps didn't know how to answer this question for me. Alhamdulillah, today we are not in that type of a climate. We are in an environment where there are a plethora of resources available to us. And it's not to say let's question everything, right? There's an adab and a respect towards this. But this idea of tafakkur and critical thinking is something that we not only see in the secular literature, but we also see it within our religious tradition as well. Now, one of the things I do want to mention too is age. Oftentimes when we think about an identity crisis or issues that people have, and when we go to communities, every single time there's somebody who has a child who is in high school and college, and they say, Brother Amin, I'm worried about my son, or I'm worried about my daughter, and this is the time when we're having an identity crisis. It's like a hurricane is going on in their lives. But according to the literature and our tradition, this is a problem that does not start in middle school or high school. It's one that begins much earlier. By the time a child is 8 years old, a significant part of their identity, their understanding of who they are, their self-concept has been established. The way to think about this is like a tree. Once the roots have been established, that tree is likely not going to move here or there. Now, it's not to say things can't change. Among our companions and in their religious tradition, we know of people who can change. This is, of course, possible. However, in general, in terms of best practice, those first 8 years matter a great deal. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Ibrahim talks about this. In ayats 24 through 26, He says, what is the metaphor, the example of a good person? It's that of a good tree that's roots run deep that have been established. And that of an evil person is one who has very shallow roots, right? Such that when that hurricane happens, when that hurricane occurs in middle school and high school, these children are, inshallah, protected. When I was at Berkeley, there was a professor that asked a very provocative question. They asked, what was the purpose of childhood? Right? Childhood is defined as this period in time when you're not able to actually add value right? So generally speaking, that period of childhood ends at like 8 or 9 years old, because at 8 or 9, anyone who has an 8 or 9-year-old, you know that at that age, the children are able to start actually having a little bit more responsibility, start taking care of themselves, so on and so forth. I will say, if my wife was here, she'd probably say that age of childhood doesn't stop until like 30, because I'm 30. That's a joke. Okay, anyways. Why is it that this period of childhood exists? And what she discovered is that it's during this period of childhood that our brains are actually developing in terms of their growing in its mass, like the actual size of the brain is increasing. And so a parent like me will think to themselves, well, I want my child to have the biggest brain. I want my child to have the most cognitive functionality. How do I do that? Well, it turns out it's through love. The more that a child feels loved, the more that child feels able to and confident to explore. And the more the child, and when we say explore for children, that means play. The more children play, the more cognitive functionality they develop. So, mashallah, I did talk to the Imam. The Imam said that there's a lot of people here who are in academia, right? So as we think about experimentation, right? Experimentation is how we as like humanity gain information or gain knowledge. For children, play is experimentation. They go to the light, they turn it on, and say, oh, this is how the light works. Oh, they put it on, oh, this is how the light turns off. Through that experimentation, children play. And children who are confident, who feel loved, are the ones that play the most. Of course, we see this in tradition as well, right? When we think about our Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be on him, and the relationship he had with his grandchildren, for example, Hassan and Hussein, right? Where he would kiss them and caress them, so on and so forth. Now, I say this because it's a prelude to the final and most important piece. In research that was done in the United States, replicated in Europe, replicated in Southeast Asia, replicated in Africa, the single most important variable, the single most important thing that impacts a child's understanding of who they are, it's not what kind of school they go to. It's not how big their house is. It's not who their friends are. The single most important variable that impacts a child's understanding of who they are is the quality of the relationship that that boy or girl has with their mom and dad. When I shared with you my story, the main character in the story of my life and the main character in the story of your children's life is actually, it was not me. I was not the main character in the story of my own life. No, my father was. My story did not even start with me. My story started with my father. This cannot be understated. When we talk about our children building confidence in who they are as Muslims in America, when we talk about our children feeling like they belong in their communities, this starts at home. It starts with mom and dad through the actions that mom and dad show to their kids, through the language that mom and dad speak in front of their kids, through the thoughts that mom and dad have that end up manifesting themselves in front of kids. Today I've shared with you a number of items. I've shared with you first the importance of age. That our ability to have a significant return on our investment related to our children starts at a young age. And for that age, the 3 items that I implore you to think about, the first being role models. Not only ensuring that our children have role models in our community, but ensuring that our prophetic and Islamic role models are ones that we present to our children in a way that is relatable. The second thing I shared about was critical thinking. That is, to allow our children to have tafakkur and contemplation and explore these answers with them such that they can build yaqeen and build an understanding of their belief. And finally, and most importantly, I shared the importance of parents. that Muslims in the United States and Canada are going through a difficult period in time. And there is a significant amount of anti-Muslim sentiment that exists today, but like the Black community and the Latino community and Jewish community before us, we too will inshallah overcome. But this change starts at home. Please join me in dua. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار رب ارحمهما كما ربياني صغيرا رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي. Ya Allah, we ask you to please give us the best of this world and the best of the hereafter, and save us from the torment of hellfire. Ya Allah, we pray for our parents. Just like they took care of us when we were babies, Ya Allah, take care of them as they reach old age. Ya Allah, we pray for our children. Allow our children to be among those who establish their prayer. Wa aqimus salat.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله